Okay, we'll turn the time over to Tony Spencer, who will be our presenter today on the Entity Framework. He's in the .NET Stack team.
All right, let's dim the lights. Okay, this is going to be fun. I'm going to do mostly live coding, so this should be highly entertaining. I went through this several times practicing, and there's all kinds of gotchas and stuff that happen. And it's probably going to happen today, so it should be fun. Some of them I've left in intentionally, some of them I'll just forget and just make that mistake again. So bear with me, help me debug my code as we write. Sound like fun? Okay, so we want to talk about Entity Framework today. How many people are using Entity Framework in their projects currently? Okay, quite a few of us. What I'm going to be presenting mostly is patterns that I've been using in Entity Framework, and I'll be honest with you, probably not all of you are using some of my patterns, and I'm probably not using some of your patterns, and I'll try to address some of the reasons why that is, and why I kind of do the things the way that I do. By the way, we're looking here at the Integration Point website. Hopefully you've all been here to the Integration Point website. We try to post articles and documentation, and all the .NET engineering forums we're posting here as well. So if you happen to miss an engineering meeting, or if you have to cut out early or something like that and need to go back and review, or you just want to see what fantastic thing was talked about, the videos are going to be posted. It takes me about a week to edit them. This one might take me a little longer because I've got to Photoshop myself and take all the gray hair out, and so that might take a while. So we'll see. All right.
What's wrong with Greg again?
What's wrong with gray, Jeff? Makes us not look young.
Is that my problem?
Yeah, I want to be a millennial.
Better no hair though, isn't it? I mean, a little bit.
Hey!
John and Jim beg to differ. Okay. All right, so to begin with, the first thing I'm going to do is increase this size here a little bit so we can see what's going on. I've gone out to my GitHub page, and I'm going to start a project, and before I start a project, I want to make sure it's tied to source control. So I'm going to use GitHub today. I could use TFS or TFS Online with Git, but I'm just going to go ahead and create a new repository. If this doesn't work, I'll abandon it really quickly. And what we're going to create today is I've decided to build the underpinnings of a .NET engineering attendance tracking application. So we'll call it .NET Forum. And something went wrong. Okay, it doesn't like that. How about something else? .NET Engineering Forum. Okay. And I'll make it public, and I'm going to initialize the repository with a README. And this is really important here. I'm going to select a Visual Studio Git ignore file. A lot of people who've been using Git run into problems in Visual Studio because their Git ignore file isn't set up correctly. It's nice that GitHub kind of does that for me. So I'm going to go ahead and create the repository. And now that I have it, I am going to copy this to the clipboard and go into Visual Studio. And I'm going to clone. Let's see. .NET Forums. Oh, it even shows it for me. Isn't that cool? So the Visual Studio integration with GitHub is really nice. So I'll just hit clone. And now it's telling me that it's been cloned successfully. I need to go ahead and create a new project or solution. So let's do that. And I'm going to use one that probably most of you rarely use, but I'm going to go under other project types. Is it other project types? Yeah, there it is. Visual Studio Solution. I'm going to create a blank solution. We'll just call this .NET Forum.
DTO?
DNF. Do not.
Typo.
No, no,
Oh, DTO? Yeah, okay. That's helpful. So click OK, and now I have a new solution. And it's connected to my Git repository already. Pretty cool, huh? All right, so that's fun. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a, well, before I do that, what we're going to do is add a class library for our data layer. But I'm going to show you the database. I went ahead and built the database ahead of time. It's hard to see, so don't worry about it too much, but I have SQL Server running locally on my laptop during development. I have a database named .NET user group, and I have a few tables in here: attendance, attendance type, connections, so on and so forth. If I pull up the diagram, it might be a little bit easier to see. So this is the diagram here, and one of the first things you'll see, and I added this just for, I can't remember who it was that asked to talk about navigation properties on Slack. By the way, you should join us on Slack. It's a great place to be, isn't it, Jim? Yes, it is. Okay. I have a couple of relationships between users, attendance, and forums that I put in, and the rest of them I kind of left out. And this is just to kind of demonstrate the differences between allowing those relationships to be there and then not having them. And we'll talk about navigation properties and how they affect things. So, but this is roughly the database. I have some data already put in there just to kind of speed things up. All right, so let's do this. We're going to use code first. How many people are using code first? Okay, so we're going to use code first, code second. So in other words, database first, code first. And I think one of the things that Microsoft did, they made a horrible mistake when they named this part of Entity Framework code first, because it's a terrible name. And they even have a blog post dedicated to the fact that they made a terrible error naming it code first. Because a lot of people saying, I can't use code first. My database engineer would freak out if I wrote all the classes first and then let my project update the database at will. And so I can't use code first, I have to use EDMX. How many people are using EDMX currently? A few. So EDMX, just so you know, in the very next version of the .NET framework, and Microsoft has been giving us some guidance and some advice on this for a little while, EDMX will be going away. It's going to be deprecated. So the sooner we move away from EDMX and move to code first, the better off we'll be in the future. So, okay.
So, Tony, why is code first a bad misnomer?
What's that?
Why is code first a misnomer?
Well, you can do what they call code first, which is you go in and you create a class. Let's say it's a user class with a first name and a last name and all that kind of stuff. You can actually, using migrations, you can say update database, and it will go out and create a table in the database for you from your code. So that's why it was named code first. But the problem is that most people using code first don't actually code first. They actually go to the database first, they create the table first, and then they generate the class from that table. So we call it reverse engineering. That's actually the workflow that more people use than actually using code first and code first migrations. Does that make sense? So.
You know, in my project, I'd go to the database, I'd make a change, and then I reverse.
Yes. You could do it the other way. You could go make the change in your model and say update database, and it would modify your table for you. So that's why it's called code first, but most people don't do it that way. All right. I'm going to add a new project to this one. I'm going to select a class library, and I'm going to make sure I choose the right one. And I'm going to name it app.data for my data layer. And it always generates this class that I don't want. So we'll go ahead and delete that. Now what I'm going to do is I need to connect to the database and grab the tables out of there and have it build all the models for me. So I'm going to go add new item. I'm going to click data on the left hand side here. And by the way, can you guys see that okay? All right. And I'm going to choose ADO.NET data model. And I'm just going to call this my, I'll call it forum context. And this wizard comes up, and you'll see there's 4 different options here. You can do EF Designer, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to select code first from database. The next thing I'm going to do is I'll select one of my connections, and I already have one that's connected to my SQL server. If you didn't have it, you could click new connection, basically fill out the information, point at your database, blah, blah, blah. And then you can include the connection string in your app config file, which will be handy for later. If you're going to do a web project, you can just copy that connection string over and put it in your web.config project. I've already I have not already done that, so I'm going to hit yes and save it. Save the connection in app.config and include sensitive data. The sensitive data they're referring to is the password, and that's okay. It's not that sensitive. It's on my local box. So we'll hit next. Now it went out there, looked at my database, and it saw all these different tables. And I can select them all. There's one table I don't want, and it's called sysdiagrams. That's the one that actually, when you, in SQL Server, when you lay out your tables, that's the diagram. It stores that in the database as well, so I don't need that one mapped. I've also created some views in my database to make it easier to look at data, and I want to bring those in because I want to use those as well. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in my views and all my tables. And there's this checkbox here that says pluralize or singularize generated object names. And I'm going to go ahead and let that do it. It's kind of fun. Sometimes it knows how to do pluralization and sometimes it doesn't. So we're just going to let it do it. Okay. So when I hit finish, this thing's going to write a bunch of code for me. It's going to be cool.
So you're not doing anything with Entity Framework yet, right? This is all SQL Server stuff.
Actually, this is Entity Framework that project, the add new item. It's an Entity Framework code first database model wizard. And so what you didn't see in the background was it went out and it used NuGet, brought in framework, Entity Framework, and Entity Framework.SQL Server. Now, Entity Framework is not limited to SQL Server. Clearly, you can use it with Oracle, like with ODP.NET or DevArt. You can use it with MySQL, Postgres, and there's a bunch of different adapters they have for it. And there'll be even more in Entity Framework 7. They're adding support for SQLite and some NoSQL databases as well.
Let's assume you were connected to a non-local database. Would you still recommend storing the password?
You know, you have to use your judgment there a little bit as far as storing the password.
Assuming you didn't want to, what would be the option?
You could say don't.
Right, and then how do you pass in the connection?
It'll do it during the generation, but it won't save it in your app config. And so, yeah.
So for our projects, we store it in web config, but it's encrypted. So
Right.
you know, you just decrypt it on the server.
Yeah, they're when you get ready for deployment and all that kind of stuff, there are different mechanisms you can use. These guys use some encryption techniques. So even if you did see what was in that password field, it would be gibberish and unusable. So, okay. So we've added Entity Framework, SQL Server. Like I said, Entity Framework 7 is going to add support for SQLite and some other ones. But I've just used SQL Server because it's simple and easy, and I have it installed on my laptop for demonstration purposes. All right, so you can see what it created here was a bunch of classes, and you can see, for instance, the attendance class. That is a combination of the forum ID, which is in our forum table, that's which .NET engineering forum it is, and the user ID itself. That's the primary key, and if we were to look in SQL Server, you would see it's the composite of those two keys. And I know that Jonathan and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. Notice how it annotated this class forum ID with the word key on both of these, and then it says column order equals 0, order equals 1. That's how it knows how to generate a composite key reference in the model. So it understands that relationship in the database. So pretty cool. Ooh, it's really big. Other than that, you'll notice that the class is just a plain old C# object. It doesn't inherit from anything else. It's just a public class attendance with some really simple fields in there. This one you'll see has a public virtual forum and a public virtual user in there as well. And I think that's because of the navigation properties in the relationships we have in the database. That's how it maps those. Some people like those. I don't. I know, and we'll see why. We'll see why I don't like them. So I typically do not use any kind of referential integrity in my databases. Yes, I said that. I don't use any referential integrity in my databases. And as a database guy, I started in the database world in data warehousing. It felt really wrong for a long time to do that, but I've gotten over it, and it's fine. And you can get over it too. Okay, so we have all these different types in here. The key that we want to look at is this class that it generated called forum context. The forum context does inherit from database context, and it creates these public virtual DB sets of attendance, attendance type, et cetera, et cetera. So this is essentially how it connects to the tables, is through this little magic in this class right here. Okay, let's use some of this. So let's go ahead and add another new project. I'm going to add a console application because it'll just be easier to test this stuff in a console app. Okay. So the first thing I want to do in my console app is set it as the default project, set it as startup. And I want to add a reference to app.data. So go under projects, app.data, add the reference. Okay, so now I can see things in that app.data class library in here. So I'm going to just create a var context equals new forum context. And I didn't spell it right. Who's helping me?
The U count.
Okay. I'm going to add the using statement, app.data. Then what I want to do is I'm just going to get a list of users. So I'll just connect to the context, and there's my users. And I'll just list that. And then I'm going to ForEach, and this isn't going to work, so we'll see why in just a minute. It's not working. How come that's not working? Okay, so I guess I have to go do this sooner than I thought. What's happening here is it doesn't understand this because this console application doesn't have a reference to the entity framework libraries itself. So I'm just going to go into NuGet, manage NuGet packages for solution, and I'm going to check app.con, click install. I thought it would let me get a little further before it puked at me, but it didn't. So nice. Okay, so now it should have entity framework installed, and now it's a little happier. So now I'm going to do the first name plus u.last name. How many times have we written code like that? And then, so that it doesn't close the window when it's done, let's just add a read key. All right, so let's run this and see what happens. Okay, we got an exception. Forum context could not find the application config file. So what do you think happened there?
You didn't set up your connection in your app.
Excellent. So if I go to my data project, remember when I saved that, it put my connection string in? Well, when I created the console application, I didn't put that connection string in the console app. So let's go over to the console app and add that connection string. What it's doing is it's looking for a connection string named forum context inside of the console project, and it wasn't there. All right, so let's run it again and see if it's happy. You know, live coding is a bit unnerving. Okay, we've got a few people in our database. Tony, Jim, Michael, and John Worthington. John, I've got some surprises for you. Just for fun, let's do something like this. Let's order by first name so they come in sorted. Run that again. Jim, John, Michael, and Tony. That puts Jim at the top. That makes him happy. If we did it by last name, though, it'd still be at the top. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so that's good enough. I'll take that back out. So what I want to show you now is when those classes were generated, they were generated as partial classes, and that's the good reason for that, and that's one of the nice things about C# is we have things called partial classes. It allows us to go and extend this class without worrying about if I have to regen the file. So let's say I added another table to my database and I wanted to regen the models. I could, and it will just replace the models that were in there. But I get tired of typing u.firstname plus space plus u.lastname. So what I want to do is I'm going to make a copy of the user class, and we'll go ahead and paste that. Where's paste? How about keyboard shortcuts, huh? And I'm going to rename this thing, and it's unhappy with me right now, and that's okay. And I'm just going to put an ext behind there. And
You have a space behind the user.
what's that?
There's a space behind the user.
Is it a space or yeah? There is a space too. Thanks. That one doesn't matter too much, but I'm gonna take out all this junk in here because that's duplicated, and it's a public partial class user, and I'm gonna create a property, and it's gonna be a string. We'll call this full name, and it'll be a get. We're going to return this dot first name plus this dot last name. Okay, and if I were using code first migrations, I would. What's that? One more squirrely. Oops, one more curly brace. Thanks. Okay, if I was using code first migrations, I wouldn't want it to go back to the database and add a field called full name. So I can use this not mapped annotation on there to tell Entity Framework not to try and go put that in the database, or don't look for it in the database, right? Okay, so let's see that in action. U dot full name, much better. Now if I were to, okay, still works, but makes it nicer. So you can extend your classes using all kinds of cool things. Let's do one more extension on that. Let's add, we have birth date in here, and I don't know, only birth date I have added in the database is mine. I don't know everybody else's, sorry. But let's add an age field. So this gets a little bit tricky, and I don't want to write it all out, so I'm just going to copy and paste. So the age field.
Is that Visual Studio Code?
That was Visual Studio Code. Did you like that? Yeah, Visual Studio Code. It's my notepad now. Okay, so this is basically it takes today, subtracts the year from the birth date value year, and then returns all this goopity goop. Now if I were to run this, I think it will work and then blow up. So let's try it. Oh wait, it won't blow up because I'm not actually showing that. So I need to call age. So in here, okay. All right, we got an exception. And the reason we have an exception is because birth date is a nullable field. And if we were to go look inside of the user, notice birth date has that question mark, that datetime question mark. It's a nullable field. And because it's nullable, the shape of it looks a little bit different. So to get the value out, you have to go birthdate.value. Problem is, what if there is no value? Well, then you get a null exception. So what we're going to do is just say this dot birthdate dot, there's a has value. If it has a value, then we'll go ahead and do all this stuff in here. And otherwise, I don't even need else, just return, we'll just put 0. Okay, do I have all my goofy braces and stuff lined up, or am I missing one? Looks like it needs one more. Okay, now if we run this, let's see what happens. Yay. Oh, you guys are young. So you can do quite a bit in the properties there. Like I said, it's really nice to have an age field and whatnot. Okay, cool. Enough of that. Next thing, let's, any questions so far? This is like, duh, we all do this. All right. Then we did the not mapped and the field, blah, blah, blah. Let's do this. Sometimes, so what's happening behind the scenes here is that Entity Framework is actually writing SQL to send to the SQL database and execute. At the end of the day, SQL Server still needs to execute SQL. So sometimes Entity Framework writes really crappy SQL. Sometimes it writes okay SQL. So it's helpful to know how to see that SQL. Well, you can get it out by using context.database.log. And we'll just do it to the write it to the console for now. And so now we're going to see the console write line write everything that would be going out to a log file. So you could attach this to a logger, or you could attach it to whatever, so you can see the SQL it's generating. So let's run this and see what kind of madness we see in here. Okay, so we see all kinds of stuff. Let's go back and just take a look and see what we have in here. Okay, first thing it did was it did a select count star from information schema tables, and it looked for all this kind of junk. And I don't know why it does that, but it does. Anybody know why Entity Framework does that? It needs it for some reason, so it did it. So upon every connection, you're going to get it to do that. The other thing it's looking for is a table called __ migration history. If you are using code first, migrations, it will add a table into the database called migration history, and every time you do a migration, it'll keep track of it. That's how it knows whether it's in sync with your current state in your application, is it stores a record inside of that migration table. So it looked there, and it found that it did not have a DBO migration history table. Okay. Next, what did it do? It tried to do it again. I'm not sure why. Okay. But here we go. Select extent1 user ID as user ID, all of that from users tables as extent1, and it completed in 46 milliseconds with result SQL data reader. A lot of that's just overhead. Once you have a connection, you can speed things up if you want to keep that open. And then it outputted the output. So that's how you can see the SQL. Kind of cool. Let's see what happens if we modify this a little bit. What if we do an order by again? Oops. We'll do it by first name this time. If we do an order by, let's see what Entity Framework does. You'll see that it did the same select, but it just added this order by first name ascending. So what if we did take one, let's do a dot skip. Skip 2 and then take 1. This is all some funky link stuff. Anybody use skip and take in their stuff? Yeah, it's great for paging, huh? It's pretty fantastic. All right, let's see what kind of SQL it generates. Interesting. So it does the order by, and then it offsets 2 rows, fetch next 1 rows only. That's some funky SQL. Anybody write that SQL by hand? What does it do? Well, if you notice in the output, it only picked Michael Gibby. What it does is there's 4 records in the database. It skipped the first 2, took the third one, and only took 1. So you can imagine in this scenario, if you're doing paging, let's say you have a list of 1,000 users and you want to page them at 10 at a time, you would say skip 10 times whatever page I'm on, take 10 more users. And then every time through that loop, you could skip 20, skip 30, and take 10. And so that's how you do paging using Link. Okay, not bad. All right, let's do this. So in my users are actually let's do a. So I have some attendance records already put in there. So I'm going to do a.u.attendances. Remember the navigation properties we have. Attendances has a relationship with users because in the attendance table we can have users attending. I can get to that simply using the navigation property u.attendances because that relationship exists, which is nice and convenient until it's not. And I have an attendance type. And let's just pick up the forum ID. So I'm going to turn off the logging for just a minute just so we can see the output, and then I'll turn that back on. All right, so it went out to the database, and it found me. It found that I attended. The first one's attendance type. That means in person. 1 is in person. 1, 2, and 3 are the different forums. That's the first, second, and third engineering forum I have in the database. Jim also attended the first 2 in person. He attended the third one later. He watched the recording. This is all a lie. Don't get all upset, Jim. It's okay. This is fake. Michael Gibby, he attended the first one. The second one he watched on WebEx. And John Worthington only attended the first one via WebEx. Again, it's a lie, so don't worry about it. Okay, so it did what we wanted it to do, but let's turn the tracking back on and see. What was the question there? Somebody asked a question. Why the .to list on user but not on attendance? Well, you need the to list to make it run to the database. Actually, you don't, because when you do the ForEach, it will actually tell it it's time to go to the database and fetch the data. The to list, just as soon as you hit to list, that tells Entity Framework it's time to take whatever SQL I've written and execute that, go get the data and bring it back. If you don't to list it, you can keep appending on like query parameters and stuff later on.
In this example, you could have just used context.users in your ForEach instead
Yes.
of writing it to it.
Yes, I could have just used context.users in my ForEach if I wanted to. Right. So let's. So I could to list the attendances, but I don't need to. ForEach will actually invoke that and tell it to go get the data from the database. Tim, question.
So because you're not calling context.users in the ForEach, does that mean you are retrieving the entire list of users? So if this was a very large data set, this would use a lot of memory.
Yes, it would.
But if you use the ForEach on the content.users,
It would still bring them all in first.
is it going to bring them all in, or is it going to iterate through?
It's not a cursor.
Okay.
Yep. You can set those kinds of things up, but in general, no. It's going to bring all the data, and it's going to put it into a list of some sort, an IEnumerable of some sort in memory. So if you do this, yeah, you're going to get everything in the list. So I would suggest using where clauses where necessary. So okay. But what I want to see is what happens when I do this. Let's turn our logging back on and let's see what happens to the database. Wow, what happened? Anybody know? Where's my scroll bar? Okay. So the first thing that it did was it went out and did our select from users. And it completed that. Then the next thing it did is it output my name, Tony Spencer, made a trip back to the database and selected forum, all this information from the attendance table where the user ID is equal to the entity key value 1. So what it's doing is for every single user, it's going out and fetching those records that apply every single time. Okay? So you might want to keep that in mind. That's a bit chatty. If I had 1,000 users, it'd be 1,001 calls to the database to go get that data back. Is that what we want to do?
Seems like it'd be more performant if you do a join and then get all the information you want from the join.
Wouldn't that be nice? Anybody have an idea of what I could do here? I could stop while I'm running. Okay, let's do an include. And 10, oh shoot, who made these names? Attendances.toList. Okay, let's run that and see what happens. Okay, that's a little better, kind of, right? It made one call to the database to fetch all that information. But in order to do that, it wrote this query. Tell me if you like that query or not.
Awesome. Subselects, they're great.
Subselects are great. It didn't use a join. It did a, well, it sort of did. It did a left outer join, which is fantastic. So it's okay, but you can see how pretty quickly you could let Entity Framework run away and write some really crappy SQL statements. I can probably write a better SQL statement than it can if I let it use navigation properties. For this reason, I typically don't use navigation properties because I don't trust that it will write good SQL. It's super convenient when you're writing your code, but I find that it can run away from you pretty quickly. So, any comments or questions on that?
So what do you do instead?
So what do I do instead? Well, there are different options. We could write link joins, and with link joins, I can be pretty specific about what I want. So let's turn this stuff off for just a minute.
Or do you have a view that does that already?
I actually do have a view that does that already. That's even better. If you create a view in the database, then you can construct that join just as you want to, and you can map on top of that, and you'll get all the benefits of not having to figure that stuff out at runtime. The database is already tuned and knows how to handle that. But if you didn't have a view created, but you still needed to do some joins, you can do some things. So let's see what that might look like. This gets a little tricky, so bear with me. I'll probably screw this one up. So var.
You're not going to copy and paste it from Visual Studio Code? No.
What's the fun in that, Jim? So I'm going to say from you and context.users join a and context.attendances, right, on u.user ID equals a, whoops, this one always throws me for a loop.
Keyword equals.
You have to use the equals keyword. Okay. And in this case, so this is going to be interesting because I'm joining two tables together, but how am I going to express that? So I can do just a select, I could do a select U and just bring back the users, but that won't show me the attendance records, right? If I select A, I'll see the attendance records, but I won't see the users. So somebody help me, what should I do?
Do a new, you can just create your own object, right?
Okay. And we'll just choose form ID. Okay. Oh, cool. Using an anonymous object, and it seems to be working pretty well.
Can you do full name? Will it still work?
We'll try that in just a minute. What do you think? Do you think it will work?
I think it will.
No, because what you're returning is no longer that object. It's
Wow.
anonymous type.
Yeah,
Otherwise, it would have shown it in the IntelliSense.
it's true.
But we could include it in the anonymous type, right? Okay. Or can we? All right, so let's run this and see what we get. All right, so I get this list of people and I get some weird stuff going on there. What's happening? It's not really that weird. I'm getting an entry for every attendance, right? So Tony Spencer attended Forum 1, 2, and 3. It's not in any kind of order that I want, but it's there. If we look at the SQL it wrote, it's not bad. So select from users, inner join attendance on these fields right there. So by using link, and I express that specifically, I say I want you to do a join on these two tables with these fields specifically, gave me a lot more control over the kind of SQL it would generate.
Why is it doing an inner join, not an outer join?
Because I told it to do a join by default is an inner join. If you want to do an outer join in link, that expression gets a little funky. You can do it. I don't want to show it here because that will make people cry, and I hate it when Jim cries in forum.net forum. Question?
Brennan, it's just milliseconds, but looking at the milliseconds and when you did previously, it actually came back faster than this one did.
Yeah. You'll see what happens is on really small data sets like this, so the question was, or the comment was the milliseconds, it took a little longer to actually execute this query than it did the other query. The indexes don't kick in until you have a little bit more data. When you have a small amount of data like this, the indexes don't kick in. So when you do a join, you're not going to be able to take advantage of indexes and stuff like that. When you get into larger data sets, you will start to see that the subselect does not perform anywhere near as well as a join does. So it's a little misleading on a small data set.
Doesn't writing the link syntax like you did right there, the query syntax, doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do with NP is not write SQL statements, which we're pretty much doing at this point, and then getting back a typed object, not an anonymous object?
Yes, so the comment is, doesn't this defeat the purpose of if you're writing basically, in this specific instance, writing SQL like syntax in link instead of in SQL, and getting a typed object back? Yeah, that's a good question. So should we get a typed object back? Would that be better?
I mean, isn't that one of the great things about Entity Framework is that I don't have to build my typed objects, they're built for me.
So yeah, one of the great things about Entity Framework is that it can, you don't have to build the type objects, it'll build it for you. Or the other thing that is nice about it is, if I don't want to have a typed object for just a certain instance, I can just use an anonymous one in this case. It gives you the flexibility to do both, and you can still do this. But yeah, Tim.
Once you've gone through this process and you've got you effectively got a view. If this is something you're going to share through the rest of the code, you can now take what you've built in your SQL query, change your view, and your code that's iterating through it doesn't change much.
Right.
So it may be, this is a means towards what's going to be your performance solution in the end. It's very easy to have it illuminate, identify all the different pieces for you.
Right. So
I found it easy.
yeah, it's nice. It's quick and easy, and obviously, like I said, there's so much flexibility here. You can go and create a view and query against the view, and I do have that. And we're going to run out of time here, but I'll show you quickly. So there was another question somebody asked about what can we get full name in there from our type, and this is good to know. So we do have a full name object still. So can I just access the full name? Not if I'm typing. Seriously. Okay. So if I run this, what do you think is going to happen?
Think you get nothing?
Yeah, you're going to get blown up. And here's why. Because this happens before the to list, what's happening is Entity Framework saying, okay, you want me to construct a query. Well, it doesn't know how to construct a query for full name. Full name is this concept I created in C#. It doesn't know how to take what I've done in that property in C# and go fetch the data in a specific way from the database with full name. So it's blowing up and saying, I can't write SQL for that. That doesn't make any sense. So
You could create a full name right there in line, though. You could say full name equals, and then
You could. We could do it in line. We could create full name equals. Like I said, link is just, and let's face it, as C# developers, right? One of the reasons we love C# is link. Clearly, This thing's bugging me. Link is powerful, and if you're like me, every time I have to drop into Java to do something, I miss Link dearly. And Link is it's just powerful. It lets you do all this really cool stuff. But it's coming. I think Java will have it here pretty soon. So, in case anybody cares.
So, so can you, and I don't want to distract from the presentation, so if this isn't valid, or you're going to cover this some other way. I mean, can't you just create instead of creating a new anonymous object, can't you create a new user object and then assign the attendants?
Yeah, we can. So, and I'm going to put this in a different place. So let's go ahead and just create one real quick. Let's create a new class, and we'll just call it user view model. And okay. Then create a couple properties here. And then, let's see, we'll just do form ID, that's enough. Okay. Seriously. Okay. So now I've just created a view model object, and what I'll do is, instead of creating an anonymous one here, we'll do a select new user VM object. We'll pass in the U and the A, and go to list. And there's no full name because we didn't create that property. So let's just take that off so it doesn't blow up. So now you have a real strongly typed type that is kind of a view model that takes the context of those two different tables and plugs it into one. And it's not an anonymous type. And it blows up. Why did it blow up? Object reference not set. Oh. So this happens when you, where's my VM? You need to make the data type match if you want to do it that way. Form ID is a nullable object. And something else is wrong. I don't know what it is. We could debug it, but essentially that's the structure that you'd use. You could create it. I like to use the constructor where I just pass in the things and it does all the mapping inside of there and makes everything look good. So, all right, enough of that. So let's say that you need to take full control. We're about out of time, so I'm going to skip some things here. But let's say you needed to take full control of the SQL. Yes, it's nice that I can write link syntax, and if the way I write my link syntax is going to generate better SQL. But what if I absolutely just need to write hardcore, down to the metal SQL? Well, you can do that.
You're still running.
Yeah, oh, cool. So I can write a SQL query, and let's call it let's use user VM since we have it. And I'm going to select u.userid, comma, u. No, it's not username. It's first name, right? First name, comma, u. Last name, comma, a. Forum ID from dbo.users u inner join dbo.attendance a on u dot user ID equals a dot user ID. Okay.
Does attendance have an S at the end?
Not in the database, it doesn't. That was, remember that pluralization that happened? Yeah. That. I'm going to call our junk. And then I don't want to write the whole right line statement, so we'll just put a breakpoint. All right. Results viewed. So it didn't work for some reason. Anybody see what I did wrong?
Your constructor, well, how does the constructor work there? Because you're not passing it a U and attendance. Well, so is it going to match up to your?
I have an empty constructor.
So is it just not going to do anything?
No, it should. So what typically happens, and I know I'm kind of going too fast. I'm sure I made a mistake somewhere in here. Let's look and see. Oh, that's what it is. I didn't alias attendance. Oh yeah, it's on there. Users interjoined internet A on u.user ID, a.user ID. I guess what we could do is just grab the SQL and make sure it's good SQL. That would be a good thing to do. It is, it brings stuff back. So why is it being stupid? Generally, what happens is it uses all kinds of weird reflection and stuff like that, and it looks for a match, first name, last name, and form ID in my object, and it maps them together and connects them for you.
Is it that user VM only has 2 parameters in its alternate constructor instead of 3, and it's looking for the form ID to be passed in?
No, it should be using the parameterless constructor for this when it news it up. It doesn't use the constructor when it hydrates the object. It actually uses reflection, reflects over the properties, does a match, and then tries to fill the data in.
Is it because it's not a public class?
Is it not public? It is. It's public. Yeah. Name and form ID. I'm not exactly sure why it's not happy with that, but that's a pretty cool thing. It does work. Trust me. When it works correctly. Hazards of live coding. Yeah.
Could it be that user VM isn't an entity object, and so it's trying to insert it into the object during the query at some point?
It says right there the type does not have to be an entity type.
It doesn't have to be an entity type. It's just plain old C# objects. It should take it and go. It's just being stubborn and weird. But I don't know. I'm not sure why that's working. I had it working earlier, and sometimes stuff doesn't work. I'll try to figure it out, and I'll let you know what I did wrong. But we're up against the hour here. There were a couple of other things I wanted to talk about. We didn't get to. I use something called a repository pattern. So generally, I don't, like in my app.console, I really shouldn't be hitting the context directly. And imagine that the app.console is your web project. You don't want to hit the context directly to do this kind of stuff. You should pass through a service layer for starters. And I also put another layer in between there called a repository layer. And it's kind of silly. When you look at the repository layer, I'll just show you what the code looks like in here. You'll see like a public, let's see, let's make this a little bit larger. It's just a one-for-one mapping. Public iQueryable of attendance, get attendances, return context.attendances. Not much in there. And all the way down, it looks like that. Well, why would you waste the time having a layer like that? Any ideas? Steve? We do it all the time. It drives Tom crazy. It's like, I gotta go put it in that layer. I had another table. I hate this. Why'd you do this? Yeah, Brennan.
So if you need to, make a more complex query or more simple query, you don't have to go change it in the service layer. You change it here, it changes it everywhere it's being used.
Yeah, that's true. That's one reason you could do it. You could put a complex query in here. You can fill this with something a little more complex if you needed to. The other reason that I do this is for testing purposes. It's really nice to be able to inject a repository, and after I create a repository, usually like this, then I'll go down and I'll create, let's see, I have it in here somewhere, an interface for it called iRepository, and I just plumb out all these interfaces. Then if I want to make a text or a test repository context, all I have to do is make sure that I adhere to that contract, and instead of returning from the context in here, I could actually just new up a list of items, hard code some values in there, and return that as a queryable back out so that I can use it for testing. So testing's one thing that's really good for. The other thing it's really good for, and we didn't have time to look at this, but is as caching. If you'll notice in my tables, I have something called attendance type, and attendance type was whether you attended in person, whether you attended via WebEx, or whether you attended later and watched it in recording. The values in that table are probably not going to change ever, probably. So every time I need that table, does it make sense to go to the database to get it? Probably not. So what I might want to do is cache that. So I could use in my repository layer, I could plumb in something that looks like this. In this case, I've got an object cache for connection type, and you'll see that it's very similar. What it does, it says, if the cache contains this type, return that from the cache directly. So it never has to go to the database to get it. Else, if there's nothing in the cache, then I'll go ahead and go to the context, the connection types, pull those in, and I stuff them into the cache by doing a cache.add, and I can set an expiration on it. So in this case, my cache expires every 2 minutes. That's not much of a cache. For something like this, I may cache it for 24 hours, and then just have it repopulate the first time somebody hits it, and there's nothing in the cache after it expires. So caching is something you can put in the repository layer very easily. When you do that, you have to keep in mind that you're no longer working with an entity object from the database. So if you try to join a cache table with a SQL table, Entity Framework's not going to be able to write the SQL for that, because it's like you're telling Entity Framework, hey, go get half of this from the database and the other half from memory, and Entity Framework's like, what? I don't know what you're doing. But you can still express it in a valid way, going and fetching from the database first, doing the join in memory afterwards with your cache data. Okay, so what else? Oh, you can also use this database.sql query. You can also call stored procedures as well and pass parameters. So there's some times where it just makes a lot of sense to use a stored procedure still and not try to do everything in Link. The biggest thing that I see people do is they try to get really complex and do it all in C# and in Link. And sometimes, you know what? Make that sucker a stored procedure and put it in the database and map to it. Don't try to get too crazy on the C# side. You kind of have to strike that balance and know when to do it. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about was just briefly, and then we'll wrap up here, is the other reason I don't use navigation properties is if you put relationships in your objects, it makes it really difficult if you want to switch to a NoSQL database. So if you keep relational concepts in your models in C#, then you tie yourself to a relational concept. And if you have to switch to a NoSQL database, which I did, I had to go through that pain. It's rare, you know, how often do we actually swap out repositories? Not very often, but it could happen. So for that reason, I avoid that as well, because you can't do those kinds of joins and stuff in a NoSQL database anyway, so don't bother. Or the mappings, Entity Framework doesn't know how to do that. So you're going to be pulling that stuff into memory to do your joins anyway. So that is the other reason I avoid navigation properties now, and I don't put relationships between my tables. So, any other comments or questions? Reddit.
So is there no built-in caching abilities in the Entity Framework right now?
There is, actually. We didn't talk about any of that at all. Entity Framework does have some caching built in. It also does tracking of changes. In web, we don't typically do that. But now with Xamarin coming, and if you guys are all going to start writing mobile applications that are stateful, you may want to use some of that change tracking. And what it does is, as you select an entity from the database, Entity Framework keeps track of it. If you change a value, like if I were to pull up Jonathan and I were to change a value for Jonathan, like his birth date, it keeps track of that. So all I have to do is call the context and say, save all changes that have been made since the last time I did that. Entity Framework will track all that stuff in the background for you. I will caution you, don't use it on the web. You get some real weird threading issues if you do that, and you can stomp on top of each other if you're not careful. So I don't do that. I don't use Entity Framework's tracking, change tracking ability on the web. I will if I'm doing it in a stateful application, but not in a stateless application. So, okay. We're out of time, so I don't want to hold you guys any longer, but thanks for coming, and we'll see you guys next month.
Earlier, when we were trying to demonstrate using link to do a join between two tables with users and attendances, and instead of creating an anonymous object, actually loading that data into a real concrete POCO class, in this case the user view model, and we created a constructor that would accept a U and an a user object and an attendances object into the constructor, and then fill out the pieces. We were getting an error, and I said I would get back to you and we would see what the error was. And so let's run this, and I think we'll see that once it hits this line here, it'll blow up and we'll have an error. So, boom, yep. And the error says object reference not set to an instance of an object. I did some research and I realized what I did wrong. Just like earlier when we were demonstrating the full name, where we couldn't put the full name in the anonymous object because Link wouldn't know how to write the SQL for that. This is the same thing going on here. Turns out that you can put these concrete, classes and types in here, but you can't use parameterized constructors. You must use the parameterless constructor. That's the only one that's allowed inside the link query. So then we can do this. And then form ID equals a dot form ID. If we do it this way, with an inline initializer, it works just fine, but we can't pass it in through the constructor that way, while it's still creating a SQL select statement. So in this case, that worked just fine. It's happy, and it's inside of a user VM object. Now, if we did want to use the constructor, we could do that, but we can't do it while it's still going out to the SQL database. So, for instance, if I did this and did this, now granted this isn't performant or anything like that, and we'd pull in the entire user list and entire attendances list into memory before we did the join. But if we did that, then it's no longer, during the select part of that, that's no longer making trying to convert that to standard SQL using Entity Framework. So that's just link, and this will work just fine as well. You can see it's going into the constructor here, and it will work because we have a user object and an attendance object. So we'll go ahead and let that continue on. And sure enough, same thing, we have 9 in there. And that's the difference. If you're trying to use a constructor with parameters, you'll have to do that on the link side. You can't do that inside of Entity Framework because Entity Framework does not know how to convert that to proper SQL. But you can use that class in there as long as you're using inline initializers. Okay, so that's the first thing. Got that one out of the way. Explains that issue. Now the second issue that we were struggling with was we were using the SQL query command and trying to write very specific SQL string to go and pull back data and load it into a user VM object and load it into this junk variable. And what we had done is it looked like it wasn't working. In actuality, it was working. So the problem was we were trying to inspect junk, and we kept getting this function evaluation requires all threads to run. Well, the problem was we got lazy there, and we can inspect that for some reason. But if we run this, it actually works just fine. And if we go look at the output, you'll see that it output the names just fine. So it was working all along. When we got in a hurry there, we just messed things up. So apologies for that. This does work, and it worked just fine. So anyway, that's all I have. So thanks.